Stereotype threat effects arise when an individual feels at risk of confirming a negative stereotype about their group and consequently underperforms on stereotype relevant tasks. And so this situation then requires a couple of components. There being a situation of a stereotype relevant task for a person to engage in, and that that the individual has concern about confirming the negative stereotype, and that concern connects to and increases the likelihood of underperformance. And so for stereotype threat to occur, as Lamont and colleagues noted in 2015, is that first there must be recognition from an individual that they do belong to the stereotype group, and then there must be an awareness of the stigma, mindfulness of the stigma, and that stigma has to be, or that stereotype has to be relevant for the self. And then the other component is that the situation has to actually present a possibility or a risk of confirming the stereotype. And so in the Lamont article that you all read, you saw the summary of the age-based stereotype threat analyses and consistently small to medium effect sizes there. We see and considered research on women and related to math scores. And so here's a great example of a study like this. Steele and Quinn, in a 1999 published study, had men and women who had similar math backgrounds were given a difficult math test. And as you can see in the condition where's my highlighter? There it is, where gender differences were communicated to the participants taking the test, and that there's an expectation that gender differences would be large. You can see there was a large difference in underperformance by women who took this math test, and then when told that gender differences were not expected, there was more of an equivalent performance between men and women who engaged in this study. And so this experience of being in a condition or a situation of potential threat and fear of confirming a stereotype can lead to disidentifying with a domain as a protective strategy. And that's actually one of the rationales for a service project that I do with my husband. We co-founded in an academic enrichment program. It meets twice a month in Boston. Now there's like a virtual component of it since the pandemic. But it was targeting youth who had kind of checked out of the school system. These were Latinx and Black youth in Boston, and who were in the Boston public schools primarily was the initial target, although it widened from there. But it was underperforming youth who had the capability but had such negative experiences in their academic training overall that they began to kind of disidentify with academics as a domain of achievement. And so that's one of the things that we can see happening when people experience stereotype threat. And this gives a depiction of that, how that process can happen. So we've got cultural stereotypes, a condition of stereotype threat, and then performance deficits lead to concerns. Then self-protection strategy, a self-protective strategy, is to disidentify with that domain, and that as a result then you're protected from the disappointment of underperformance in that domain. We see other research on women resulting in differences in performance. So there have been studies on Asian American women who take math tests in these particular experiments, and then under a gender prime, participants scored considerably worse, but then under a prime that focused on Asian identity, scores were elevated. And so there are ways in which this stereotype threat prime can actually even enhance and augment performance overall. What are some of the expected, anticipated mechanisms of the effects of stereotype threat? Well, one is the result of stress. And so fMRI studies show that there's impaired activity in certain aspects of neural networks related to logic and mathematical reasoning in this study, similar to the one that the few that I've described, and then as well as an increase in areas of emotion processing. And then there's also the result of the increased cognitive load from self-monitoring, so concern about potential mistakes can interrupt one's focus on the task, and as well as suppressing kind of these unwanted thoughts and emotions can lead one to regulate in a way that disrupts the effort to regulate, disrupts working memory, and so that can leave fewer resources to deal with that task at hand. And so we consider the way in which people might naturally try to protect themselves from this, which would be to withdraw from that domain, kind of disidentify with it as an area of achievement. Another example of reducing that effect that literature shows is not emphasizing the domain associated with the stereotype, which I think is a somewhat useful strategy, but then I'm particularly interested in strategies that don't require downplaying an aspect of one's social identity in order to decrease the likelihood of activating a stereotype, but instead ways of disempowering or weakening the effect of the stereotype, instead kind of targeting more on the stereotype threat end of things than on the social identity end of things. But we do know from the literature that reducing the salience of the social identity related to the stereotype threat does help to mitigate the effects of it. Something that I am more of a fan of, that I like more, I'm going to kind of take you all through a little bit of this exercise. So pause for a moment. Well, wait till I get to the next screen and give you the instructions, then pause. Imagine yourself in a stressful situation or about to enter into a stressful situation that might trigger some sort of fear of underperformance. Perhaps it was the quiz that we got, that the power going out interrupted us from being able to take today, or any other kind of situation. Maybe it's a sporting situation or something else. And before you engage in that activity, you did this exercise, and take a moment to actually do this now. Think about and jot down some notes about a value, a belief, a talent, or a skill that you are proud of. And just take a moment to do that. You can pause the video to do that. Okay, so I'm assuming you had a chance to go ahead and reflect on something. And if you experience some similar effects as children and adults in studies asked to do a similar activity, then this might help to inoculate against stereotype threat. Bowen and colleagues in a 2012 study used these types of self-affirmations in a group of African American children and had them write for 15 minutes very much about that prompt that I just showed you all. And so in the control condition, just wrote about their least important values, something that they valued, but least among all their values. And then they had another version of the study where they had the children not only write about a value, but then they had the teachers read what the children wrote in order to kind of do a bit of a Bronfenbrenner nested context to go from the individual to the just wider out in the microsystem with the teachers. And so in that study, what they found in the experimental condition is that there was a significant effect, and it was a medium effect size of the protection against underperformance. And specifically, they were looking at declines in quarterly social studies grades, which they typically decline for all students. And on average, they declined over 4 quarters by 4 percentage points. And so the control group, that was their decline in this study. But the experimental group, their declines in social studies grades was only over 4 quarters, was only about half a percentage point. So you could think that's definitely a considerable protection within the context of the quarterly grades. And then in the condition where the teacher read the student's self-affirmation, as you can imagine, part of what that does is that increases the kind of the teacher viewing the student as an individual with positive qualities, and may have impacted the teacher expectations of the student, and likely helps to offset the fundamental attribution error, which is to think more about to kind of decrease emphasis on what other reasons might be going on for an individual that might explain their performance in an area. And so just kind of this humanizing, this connecting, I would expect that's all part of the mechanism that went into the teacher reading, or the impact of the teacher reading the student's affirmation. And so what they found in the condition where the teachers read is that there was an even greater effect, even more success above and beyond, and that was significant above the student writing alone. And so self-affirmations were demonstrated with children as being beneficial against stereotype threat. And then also in the context of another study by Hall and colleagues in 2014 that was done with low-income individuals who frequented a soup kitchen. What they had those individuals do was a similar kind of a values self-affirmation task. This one was verbal. They wanted to keep it verbal and not written, not being certain of what the range of literacy was in the group. And so they had the individuals verbally describe a personal experience that made them feel successful or proud. And then they had them complete measures of cognitive control, as well as fluid intelligence and they investigated the impact of this self-affirmation on their willingness to utilize a benefits program. And so what they found is that in the affirmed condition is in the dark shaded, and then the neutral condition is in the non-shaded bars. And so in the affirmed condition, we can clearly see that there was a significant impact on fluid intelligence as measured by Raven's matrices. And so those who affirmed performed better on measures of fluid intelligence, as well as measures of executive functioning, the cognitive control. It was a cognitive control task that they were doing. And so there was improved performance in the affirmed condition. But then there also was an effect on the willingness to consider using benefits program. And particularly, they had a flyer and were to indicate willingness to utilize the benefits program, and that they saw that those in the affirmed condition tended to stop more frequently, as well as to take a flyer on the benefits program, and then later analyses to use the benefits program later. And so they also did a comparison, a positive mood induction condition, and that had no effect, so affirmations were better than the positive mood condition. And another comparison in the study that they did that was neat was to look at the potential effect of the comparison group among wealthy participants, and there was no effect among wealthy participants. And so that makes sense, because this is argued to be an approach that offers a protection against stereotype threat in a domain. And so there wouldn't, for a wealthy individual, there wouldn't be kind of a stereotype threat that would be heightened as compared to someone who is low SES status. Okay, so right there, that concludes our material on prejudicial attitudes towards various groups, as well as contributing factors from the social to the motivational to the cognitive sources, and then the consequences within the context of stereotype threat. And then we covered some research on how to offset the effects of stereotype threat. So I'm going to pause this here, and that way I'm going to pick up in a second video for the material on aggression.